Welcome to the fourth edition of the Advertising and Marketing Law podcast on the Agenda channel. My name's Brinsley, Dresden. I'm one of the co-heads of the Advertising and Marketing Law team at Lewis Hulkin, and I'm joined...
I'm Geraint, Lloyd-Taylor. I'm the other co-head of the Advertising and Marketing team at Lewis Hulkin.
And today marks a super exciting development, I think you'll agree, in the history of our Advertising and Marketing Law podcast, because we have our very first guest appearance.
I feel honoured.
You are honoured, but so are we. We are particularly honoured to welcome Benedict Pringle, who is the founder of politicaladvertising.co.uk website and the co-founder of the Reform Political Advertising organisation with Alex Tate. Give Alex a shout out as well. But Benedict also has a day job as a partner at TMPM. So the subject of today's discussion is the thorny issue of the regulation of political advertising, or in fact, the absence thereof in the United Kingdom. And there is a risk in this conversation of the three of us furiously agreeing with each other. And so we're going to try to disagree with you a little bit just for the purposes of making this interesting, even though, in truth, our dirty little secret is that we agree with you completely. So, Benedict, do you want to start by just setting the scene of what is the current status of the regulation of political advertising in the UK?
So, there is very, very little regulation of election advertising in the UK, and that isn't hyperbole. If you read the websites of the ASA, for example, or the Electoral Commission, they state very clearly that there is almost no electoral content regulation. There are some rules, two that spring to mind. One is that any piece of election communication has to have an imprint on it, so it has to say who the candidate is who is sponsoring that piece of communication. And the other one is that you are not allowed to say anything that sort of accuses incorrectly or defames someone's character. And that's just a sort of standard defamation thing. That isn't particular to election advertising or anything like that. Other than that, you can honestly say what you like. And the ASA has no powers to get any advertising taken down or amended, nor does the Electoral Commission, nor does Ofcom, nor does anyone else, the police, anyone else that you might think of. There is no rules on it. And I have always thought that is bizarre and inappropriate and poisonous to our political discourse. So, I'm a keen campaigner to change it.
And actually, I came across something recently which shows that even the rules about the imprint are actually offering very little protection to people. So something was put through my front door. I live in Tulip Sadiq's constituency of Hampstead and Kilburn. I live more in the Kilburn bit than the Hampstead bit, I'm afraid to say. And it was a very sort of unbranded piece of literature attacking Tulip Sadiq, and eventually, I thought, this is very odd. Who's put this through my door? And eventually, in tiny print, down one side and written horizontally. Vertically. I mean, written down the side, it said, from the local Conservative Party. And you think, okay, well, you've obeyed the letter of the law requiring an imprint, but boy, oh boy, have you done your best to make this as easy to miss as possible.
And one of the big omissions in the legislation is you don't have to say who the party is. You just have to say who the candidate is. And most people have got no idea who the candidate is. And so you can just say on the imprint, promoted on behalf of Joe Bloggs. Doesn't matter if Joe Bloggs is a Conservative or Labour or whatever it might be. And one of the things that we've seen in recent years is parties using that and taking on the branding of other political parties, so putting things in green or blue or red or whatever, so people assume it's coming from a particular sponsor of an attack, when actually it's not. And we know that in any piece of attack communication, there's always an element of blowback on it. If you say something rude about someone, even if you agree with it, someone's going to go, oh, well, maybe you're a bit rude because you've said something rude about, you're saying something about someone else. So there's all sorts of loopholes which we think are really problematic. So even the current very minimal regulatory framework is unsuitable.
Now, bear in mind, I promised everybody I would disagree with you a bit. Of course, it's worth remembering that political advertising is completely prohibited in broadcast media in the UK. So we do need to kind of contextualise this problem and remember that, we don't have the equivalent of what they have in the States, of the kind of crazy ads, the attack ads, which I think they have in the United States. Now, actually, when we were talking before, I think you were saying you might actually welcome political ads on broadcast media. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think it's a strange relic of the past that we say, say I'm watching YouTube on my TV at home. This is before Google banned election ads. But say I'm watching YouTube on my TV at home at the last election. Political parties were running TV ads. They are ads. They are on my TV. Say if I'm listening to Spotify or an excellent podcast like this very one, you can be played election ads. But if you're listening to the radio, you can't. And I just think that you can do it on podcasts and on Spotify and on YouTube. But on Amazon Prime, but you can't do it on Channel 4 or on TalkSport. I just think it's ridiculous.
Yeah, my concern with that, there are a number of concerns with that. One is that if we liberalise the rules, it would mean that people with the deepest pockets, obviously would have an inbuilt advantage and could simply buy more media. And we've seen with certain very wealthy individuals promising to make big donations of money to particular political parties, although they then seem to row back from that a little bit. And you think, well, if some very wealthy donor decided, I'm just going to give a huge amount of money to a political party so they can buy airtime, or I'm going to leverage my position to get donations of airtime, then the people they back would have a huge advantage over everybody else. That seems to me that would not be a good development.
I would argue that is already the case, because if you wanted to spend a huge amount of money on YouTube, YouTube's penetration on TVs is massive, or on podcasts or whatever. That sort of horse has bolted. So either you need to bring in regulation to much tighter spending limits, and by the way, at the last general election, spending limits were increased significantly. So either much tighter spending limits, or try and make some sort of new rule which outlaws certain types of digital media, which is a bit broadcasty, and I just think that will be very difficult to do. So the thing I would say is that there are quite tight spending limits within election periods, and so, as I said, the spending limit did go up hugely at the last general election, but there was still a limit, and it was still not extremely high compared to, say, the USA. So we do still have some checks and balances within that election period.
And do you see them going hand in hand, I suppose? No regulation means it's quite dangerous to allow it, but if you've got sort of rules of the game, then you can allow it in more media.
So I would certainly feel better about increased spending limits and releasing the ban on TV and radio if there was a good regulatory environment in place. So that would probably be my caveat. So let it rip on TV.
Yeah. And in terms of what that looks like, so what is your dream position when it comes to having some sort of regulation? I know we're going from a sort of standing start.
Yeah.
Where are you aiming for, do you think, in your mind?
So I think we need something like the self-regulatory setup that we have in the advertising industry for elections. And so I think we need some sort of body, which probably isn't the ASA, but probably has some ex-ASA people involved in it, that can establish a code of conduct that the political parties sign up to and sort of pledge to agree to, and then that body can implement the code and enforce any rules and all the rest of it. So I think broadly that is what we're saying. And I think that it can operate in a very similar way to the ASA does. So the public can complain about ads, and then those complaints can either be upheld or not. The body would have the power to sort of ask for claims to not be used or for ads to be taken down. So I think it would be a very similar setup that we've got with the ASA, but with some tweaks probably in terms of speed and in terms of wording of the code to make it applicable to elections.
And that's one of the criticisms, I guess, isn't it, of the ASA in this sort of environment. You can't just make the ASA the regulator for a multitude of reasons, not least because they don't want to be, and it would sort of compromise them probably in a broader sense and make them take part in these sort of political discussions, but also because they do take a fair amount of time to investigate some particularly complex claims, and some of the sorts of claims that people are very het up about would be fairly complex because there would be potentially statistics on either side or information that might sway either side.
Yeah, certainly one of the criticisms of this is that it just wouldn't work, it's unworkable. And so to counter that claim, we, in the last general election, set up something called ERP, or the Election Advertising Review Panel, and that was chaired by Lord Putnam. And we sort of established our code of conduct. We got a bunch of advertising experts. We got someone from the IPA. We had someone from campaign, someone from Full Fact, so a fact checker. And we said to this group of people, when we find ads that might have a claim which might be problematic, we will send them to you, along with any stimulus which might help you decide whether they are misleading or not. Please reply within 24 hours with your ruling, and then we will sort of give our ruling. And it was a process that worked incredibly well. And I guess one of the interesting things about elections where it's different to the commercial landscape is there are lots and lots of people fact-checking things all the time. And so, in terms of the investigation that goes on, whether it's groups like Full Fact or the BBC, there is quite heavy-duty analysis of claims and counterclaims already to draw on. So actually that process was very workable. I hope we have gone some way to prove that it's possible to do it.
I like that approach. Just do it.
Just do it
yourselves. Yes, no, that's brilliant.
Yes, and that does have a lot of merit. And it's worth saying that on the Reform Political Advertising website, you do have an analysis of political advertising from 2024 and also I think from 2019 and even the election before that.
Yeah.
And your sort of analysis of where they broke the rules in different ways is very interesting and is a compelling argument in favour of what you're advocating. I mean, one problem, you mentioned Lord Putnam. I think I'm right in saying that Lord Putnam is a Labour peer. I don't know whether he sits on the Labour benches or is a crossbencher.
I think he's a Labour peer, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm sure he's, I have no intention of impugning his integrity at all, far from it. I think he's an admirable man, but you can imagine if one had an organisation and Lord Putnam was part of it and they upheld the complaint. So, for example, one of the ads that you look at in your analysis was a reform ad. Immigration isn't working. A bit of a kind of parody of the famous Labour isn't working Saatchi and Saatchi campaign from back in the day. And in your analysis, you kind of point out all the misleading and factual inaccuracies in that ad. But what worries me is that if that went through the process, and quite rightly that was exposed as being misleading, then you can imagine one of the populists, Farage for reform, saying, "Oh well, this is the establishment. Look at Lord Putnam's a Labour peer. Of course, he's going to uphold the complaint against us." And there is a risk that they would sort of use it to make heroes of themselves in the way that somebody like Tommy Robinson makes it.
Yeah.
I'm telling you the truth that they don't want you to hear.
I think there is undoubtedly a risk that as soon as something can be banned, people will want to be banned in order to generate PR behind it. I think it's probably preferable to have a system that works most of the time, and occasionally someone uses it as a way to generate some headlines, than to have nothing at all, would be my feeling on it. And you make a really good point about there needs to be agreement on the makeup of the panel who are making these decisions, and I think all the political parties who are involved in it would need to be satisfied that this was, as far as is possible, something which is neutral, and the decisions arrived at in as objective a way as possible. And I think that is not beyond the will of man.
And well, getting their buy-in, I suppose, is the way to do it, because otherwise either way you become a political football if they disagree with what you want to say, or want to pad something out in the press for a few weeks anyway. But I suppose on the other end of that journey, if you want a sort of ASA-style ruling, if you like, do you have in mind that there would be additional sanctions, or is it enough that it is declared a misleading claim or a misleading communication somehow?
I think saying it's a misleading claim, I think crucially the power to have the ads taken down.
Yeah.
And I think that is definitely one of the things that the ASA has in its armoury, is that ultimately it has the media owners on board, and if they say take it down, it will come down. And I think in a very tight campaign, when every percentage counts, the threat of saying if you keep making misleading claims, or if you don't adjust this claim, your ads will not be allowed to run, I think would be a pretty good stick with which to beat people.
But look, you're more of a man of the world than we are. We're lawyers who live in our ivory tower.
This is the view from
welcome to our ivory
It's
tower.
lovely.
It's more sort of steel and concrete. You get the point. And God, I can imagine a world in a media owner's office where somebody comes in and says, "Look, this ad, there's been a finding against it. We have to take it down." And people in the media owner's office going, "Do you know what? Yeah, but this is the party that they're a pretty racing certainty to win the upcoming election. Do we really want to upset the incoming government, who are going to win the election the day after tomorrow, by taking down their ad and just annoying them for no useful purpose, when next week we're going to start the process of pitching for business from the new government?"
Yeah.
So why don't we just kind of...
Do you know what? I think the group of people who will welcome this the most will be the media owners, because they are at the moment in the most unenviable position where they not have to run the ads, but they tend to run ads, and when there is a complaint, there's nowhere for that complaint to go to, and by and large it ends up going to the media owner. Let me give you an example. In 2019 there was an ad ran in Walthamstow, in Stella Creasy's constituency. Stella Creasy had been quite an outspoken campaigner for pro-choice regarding abortion. She was also someone who had very publicly talked about the fact that she had suffered miscarriages in the past, and she was pregnant at the time. And a pro-life campaign group decided to run a billboard ad in her constituency with the headline saying "Stop Stella" on it. And it was designed to try and get people to vote against Stella Creasy at that upcoming general election, in order to sort of punish her for her views about abortion. Stella Creasy, obviously one of the most prolific campaigners in our democracy, she sees it and is appalled, offended. Starts, however many hundreds of thousands of followers on X, immediately starts calling out the media owner, saying, "How could you possibly let this run?" All the rest of it. Then is trying to get huge reputational potential damage to the media owner. She's then, as a sidebar, calling up the police, calling out the police on, and the police are saying there's nothing we can do. And it was a great example of, there is literally nothing anyone can do. This ad is there, and ultimately it fell down to the media owner to say, "Are we going to keep this up or take this down?" And the media owner then puts themselves in a very difficult position from a sort of freedom of expression perspective. So do they take it down and risk, being taken to court for, not allowing free speech? So, and that example I've given you is just one. I could point you to that happens all the time, where the media owner gets caught in the flack between what is allowed to run and what isn't. It'd be much better if there was an independent body who goes, actually, do you know what, Stella Creasy, you might not like it, but that ad is fine, and it's good to go.
Yeah.
Or the other, and say, no, it's grossly offensive, it needs to come down.
But media owners can do that. I mean, for example,
They can, but it's not their. Should they be able to? So another thing that really grinds my gears is when Mark Zuckerberg or whoever it is, Google most recently, stand up and go, do you know what? We've changed our minds about what is allowed to run as election advertising or what isn't. It's not. It shouldn't be up to the media owners to decide that. This is election advertising is a really important tool to inform the electorate. And there's lots of studies which show the more election advertising there is, the more informed the public are, which obviously makes such total sense. So I'm a passionate believer in the good that comes from election advertising, which is one of the reasons why I want to reform it, because I think, it's hard to say that you're a passionate believer in it and the good it can cause when there are some clear problems with it. When the media owners are saying, we've decided these are the rules, it should be, our democracy is deciding what the rules are, and the media owners should have to go along with it, not the other way around.
So I can see that if you have a code and you have a sort of new system, it's not just misleading claims that are going to come within the remit, ideally, but offensive offensive claims and offensive sort of implications, etc. Do you foresee that being the same sort of approach the ASA has been taken, to bring it back to the ASA again, and just adopting their serious or widespread harm or offence style test? Or do you think, because of what's at stake and because there needs to be a free-flowing discussion, that maybe it has to reach a higher threshold before it's something that needs to be pulled under these sort of things?
Yeah, I'm imagining it in our utopian future of ad regulation. I'm imagining it would be a higher threshold.
Yeah.
I do think it's important that it would have some sort of level of offence in there, but I think it would need to be a higher threshold. And actually, in New Zealand, they have this exact system in place where the ASA actually do run election ads. So for all the people out there who say it can't be done, it can be done. It is being done in New Zealand. They have a higher threshold for that sort of thing.
Right.
But I understand in New Zealand, they only apply effectively Section 3 of the CAP Code about misleadingness.
Yeah.
So there's nothing about harm and offence.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I noticed in your code, which if people would like to look at it, your draft code is on the Reform Electoral Advertising website. And I've got it in front of me, and it's about making every reasonable effort not to mislead voters and making sure factual claims are accurate and I think effectively substantiated.
Yeah.
That's very much reflects the New Zealand position and the CAP Code Section 3. That's fine.
Yeah.
But it doesn't say, you can't be offensive. So we could still have that kind of knockabout advertising with famously demonised with Tony Blair.
Yeah.
I particularly liked the one with the next Tory leader, whose name's popped out of my head, who became Foreign Secretary, Hague.
Yeah.
Hague with the Margaret Thatcher style wig. That was so funny.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of offensive if you're very thin-skinned and you're Mr. Hague, but that would be.
Absolutely.
You would have nothing to say about that.
No,
you wouldn't mind that. That's
as I say, I love election ads for that reason. Is I think they are great fun, and those are amazing ads that you've referenced. So, and you're right. In our code, we don't include anything on offence. I guess if the question was, could you imagine a future where there might be some sort of provision for something like that?
Yes, whipping up hatred or whatever else it might be. It would be quite a high threshold.
Yeah. But Stella Creasy, I don't agree with her on everything at all, but there's an awful lot that I do agree with her, and I have a great deal of respect for her. She's a fantastic politician. You've touched on the abortion issue, and I remember years ago when I used to think about this issue, I used to think, well, they should allow advocacy advertising, for example, on television. And the thing that then made me slightly change my mind about that was the fear that you could have sort of people with very fundamental pro-life views starting to advocate for reversing the abortion laws or reversing laws on same-sex marriage or whatever, whatever you want to use as an example, and putting a lot of money behind it and moving the public perception of those issues. So I am concerned that, particularly with TV ads, once you let the genie out the bottle, then you don't really know what you're going to end up with.
But, well, to your point, though, if you're already allowing it on YouTube and other media, I don't think it makes a difference necessarily in that sense.
Yes, as the world has moved on, TV advertising is no longer the kind of all-important media that it was. But you've also touched on free speech. It does seem to me anomalous to, on the one hand, be recognising the critical importance of free speech, particularly in relation to political speech, on the one hand, but on the other hand saying, here's a code that people need to sign up to, and you know, a body can adjudicate and decide whether or not your ad should come down.
So I acknowledge the tension there. I think the problem with having misleading claims being allowed in election ads is that it can really jeopardise the acceptance of the result of an election, and I think that is a real problem, and I think something that we have started to see a little bit of in recent years, and I think the possibility that might get worse is quite strong as long as this continues. And so I think being able to curtail people's ability to say things that are misleading, I think, is a reasonable adjustment of political free speech.
I was just going to ask, speaking of the US, do you look to the US now and what's going on at the time of recording? Still a functioning democracy on paper. Where are we? Mid-Feb.
We love the United States, and any
but we
of our US clients are watching. We love the United States, obviously.
But worry deeply for it.
Yes.
And so do you think that that is an opportunity to look at, whilst we're reforming, or in the ideal utopia that we're talking about, reforming these sorts of rules in the UK, that we look at how these things might be tested and pressed and sort of put under pressure? Does that inform the way that you have looked at your own code, the draft code, or how you might look at enforcement?
Yeah, I guess you worry that, and I think there was a bit of this in the 2016 EU referendum, where I think there was a lot of not accepting of that result, and I do think part of that was two of the biggest claims in that election. One was around the famous 350 million to going to the NHS instead of going to the European Union, and the other one was Turkey is joining the European Union with however many people who will be able to come through freedom of movement to this country. Both factually incorrect, and a very close election, and we had utter turmoil after that election. And I think had we had rules in place that might have stopped that, I think maybe the result would have been better accepted. I think people felt like, or some people felt like, it was won under false pretenses. I think that is toxic, and I think we saw a lot of that coming through afterwards. And what I find annoying about all of this is, as a advocate and proponent of creative advertising, there's lots of ways to convince people. There is no need to lie, and I think it's lazy, one, so I don't like that from a creative perspective, and two, I think it creates real problems for people accepting the result.
I mean, I agree. I mean, those are two standout examples of really egregious false advertising. But number one, that was in the context of a referendum, so it is a little bit different from a normal UK general election. It was a binary yes/no kind of vote. So I think the potential for those lies, to call them what they were, to influence the result was much greater because it was a referendum rather than an election. But even then, as somebody who didn't accept the result in 2016, and I don't accept the result 8 years later, I'm not sure how good is the evidence that it really does make a difference. I'm sort of left feeling that the people who were going to voted leave. The people who were going to voted remain. Is there really anybody that was swayed by those ads? And coming forward to, say, 2024 in the last general election, And is there really any evidence that anybody ever changes their mind on whether to vote Labour or Conservative or Lib Dem or Green or whatever, Reform, on the back of some misleading advertisement?
I think there is evidence that the campaigns matter. So if you look at the data from 2024, the number of people who changed their minds through the campaign on who they thought they might vote for and who they ended up, obviously self-reported, so take that with a pinch of salt, is a high number. And I've been working on a sort of post-campaign analysis, and if you're trying to look for examples of where different aspects of the campaign had an impact on the discourse, they are there. So, for example, one of the hot claims from 2024 was that the Labour Party's manifesto would mean an extra £2,000 for every family in Britain if they won. And that was sort of a contested claim. And what is interesting is if you look at Google Trends data from when that claim was launched to later on in the campaign, there's a huge spike in searches for Labour's tax plans. And so you can really clearly correlate that there's a message that's gone out there, and it was across channels. Rishi Sunak used it in debates. It was also used in adverts, but and also the press obviously reported on it. But a claim was made, and it had a big impact on the behaviour of people seeking out information about the election. And I guess the thing I've been wondering myself, the issue we had as an organisation with that claim was that the £2,000 was actually over the course of 4 years, so it was actually £500 per year. And I think if you applied the sort of reasonable median voter response to £2,000, I think they would assume it was £2,000 per year, would be our argument. So if the claim was accurate and you said Labour's tax plans means it's going to be an extra £500, would that have had the same impact on people's behaviour and the salience of the issue of tax had at that election? I would argue it wouldn't. And so I do think there's an example there where you can look at a claim was chosen, framed in a very particular way to make it seem impactful, and then it did have an impact, versus what the truth was, or a less misleading way of portraying it, which I think would have had a much lesser impact. So that's just one small example, but I do think it makes a difference.
I think that's an important example because it's probably the most recent one that we have. But then I would say, Labour won by a landslide. So although, yes, it had an impact, yes, it was misleading, in the end, Labour still won by a landslide. And it's hard to imagine that they could have won by an even bigger landslide but for that campaign. So this is my point about, does it really...
But it's interesting, like, I think the Conservatives, this is the least popular opinion of all time, and I'll be prosecuting it in this chapter of a book that's coming out.
This is great. Go for it.
Looking at the data, I actually think the Conservatives campaign was much better than people think. If you look at the number of people who were considering voting for the Conservatives, who then ended up voting for them, the Conservatives left very few people on the table. If you look at the number of people who considered voting Labour, I think it was something like 75% of people considered voting Labour, but 34% of people actually went on to vote for them. So in terms of their funnel, as we might talk about it in marketing terms, Labour's funnel was actually pretty leaky, and the Conservatives' funnel was actually pretty efficient. So you could argue that is an example of a campaign that actually worked pretty hard to get you're never going to get people through an advert from not considering to turning up to vote from in the polling booth. But I think you probably could get people from, thinking about it but not sure, through to, I'm voting for them. And so, I actually think the Conservatives campaign was pretty effective. And I think that claim was a clever one. Clever, I should caveat that.
From a marketing perspective.
From a marketing perspective, and within the current framework of which there is none.
Thank you. We've come to time. As ever, we could talk about these things for another half an hour easily.
Very much so.
But we've come to time. So thank you very much, Benedict.
Yes, and we always like to put out something on our blog, adlaw.lewissilkin.com, in support of the podcast. And so we'll do that when this goes out, and we'll put in some links to the Reform Political Advertising website, and particularly, as I say, to your analysis from of the 2024 results, because I mean there is no doubt that there was a lot of misleading advertising. So if people want to know more, they can link through, or just go direct to the website, and also your draft code is on the website. So yes, thank you very much, Benedict.
Thank you for having me. It's been great
To have you, and thank you everybody for listening.
Thank you.